Indiana Jones' many adventures take place in some of history's biggest moments, but do the films accurately represent that history? There's obviously creative liberties taken throughout all the movies, but indie movies get more history right than you might think. Let's take a look at the 10 things Indiana Jones franchise gets right about history. But before we do that, just a quick reminder, like this video if you enjoy it. If you want more content about indie, Star Wars, entertainment, and video games, subscribe to this channel. Head to our website, strangeawesomegames.com, for even more great content on all of nerd culture. Number 1, the Antikythera was a real thing that Archimedes invented. The Antikythera was the MacGuffin in Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and the device itself is a real thing that was invented by Archimedes. Early in the film, the Antikythera is seen by the Nazis as a consolation prize for Hitler when the Lance of Longinus proves to be a fake, but it's Archimedes as the inventor that appeals to the Nazis. In the film, the Antikythera becomes a time travel machine, which is pure fantasy. In reality, however, the Antikythera is held in extremely high regard. In fact, many scientists refer to it as the first computer, and it's called as such by scientists developing computers in the 1950s. The Antikythera only remains in fragments today, but it would have been a box with several circles on it rather than the dial we see in the film. But for film's purposes, a dial you're trying to assemble makes more sense for a fun plot than lugging around a box. As an Archimedes bonus, he's the one who discovered water displacement, so the scene in Archimedes' tomb with the water displacement as the solution to the puzzle is extremely fitting. 2. The Nazis were really obsessed with archaeology and the occult. 3 of the 5 Indiana Jones films feature the archaeologists doing battle with the Nazis, racing against them to save some religious artifact from falling into their hands. Back in the time of World War II in the Nazi era, Heinrich Himmler wanted to prove that German culture had existed all across Europe before the people that were in those places now, thus giving Germany some sort of right to those lands. He led efforts that invested enormous amounts of manpower and resources into archaeological digs that sought to find artifacts associated with the occult. Although he had no scientific training or education, he thought himself an authority on this stuff anyway. The Nazis hoarded artifacts from different cultures that they had essentially stolen, and as World War II turned against the Germans, Hitler became more and more convinced that the secret to Nazi victory was in discovering some holy artifact that held great power. From that standpoint, it's not hard to imagine them pursuing something like the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail. 3. The Tanis Excavation in Raiders of the Lost Ark was actually pretty accurate. Okay, so the Tanis story in Raiders is wildly different from reality. In the movie, Tanis is said to have been buried by an immense sandstorm that lasted a whole year. In reality, Tanis was a community on a tributary of the Nile, and as the river's path shifted away from the settlement, Tanis was abandoned. However, the excavation itself in the film is mostly accurate as far as archaeological excavations go. A story in the Chicago Sun-Times states that the depiction of the Tanis dig was pretty spot on for what massive desert excavations would have looked like in the 1930s. The article goes on to say that there was a dig in Iraq by archaeologist Henry Field that looked incredibly similar to what we see in the 1981 film. 4. The Red Scare was a very real thing. The 1950s saw a lot of hysteria about the Soviet Union in the United States, and some politicians worked to create an environment where anyone who opposed them was labeled as a communist sympathizer and essentially shamed and exiled. The desire to turn one's political opponents into something people see as evil or the enemy has long been a staple of American politics, and the Red Scare in the 1950s was a high point for this in the 20th century. It became so severe that people were even turning over their spouses to the government as suspected communist sympathizers. If you've seen the fantastic movie Oppenheimer, the final act of the film largely deals with the persecution Robert Oppenheimer dealt with as a result of this hysteria. 5. The Red Scare was especially prevalent in academia and Hollywood. When Indiana Jones was fired as a professor in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, it's really not far off from what could be considered historically accurate. In the 1950s, many professors didn't see things a certain way, were labeled as communist sympathizers trying to brainwash students. I'm sure that doesn't sound familiar at all today, but it happened back then. Of course, this is just a tactic to dismiss and demonize people who don't agree with you, but when messaging is as powerful as it was, people get caught up in it pretty easily. It's portrayed pretty well in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. In the film, American hysteria is Indy's enemy just as much as the Soviets themselves are. 6. The Thuggees in Temple of Doom were real, kind of. They weren't a religious cult that ripped the hearts out of human sacrifices, but the Thuggees really did exist in India. They weren't really around in 1935 when Temple of Doom took place either. In reality, the Thuggees were a group of thieves and murderers in India in the 18th century. A report by NPR dove into the history of the Thuggees a bit, and while they weren't religious cultists, they did use their charm and charisma to gain trust of wealthy people traveling to India only to take advantage of them and rob them. Don't get the idea that they were just charming swindlers, though. The Thuggees were assassins who were thought to have murdered thousands of people. As their legend grew, so did the propaganda about them. British colonialists began spreading the tales that Thuggees were religious cultists who worshipped Kali. That's likely the lore that the film takes on. Starting in the 1830s, British Captain William Sleeman began a campaign to eradicate the Thuggees from India. In about 6 years' time, 4,000 Thuggees were captured and 2,000 of them were convicted. Sleeman declared the organization destroyed shortly after. 7. The Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword was based on a very real thing from history. In Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, the Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword is a centuries-old group tasked with protecting the Holy Grail. Although they're also trying to keep the Grail a secret, they fight the Nazis alongside Indy in the third act of the Last Crusade. The Brotherhood of the Cruciform Sword isn't real, but it's based on the very real Knights Templar. The Knights Templar originally existed to protect Christian pilgrims who were traveling to the Holy Land, but over the many years since, they've been given more and more duties from the Pope. One of these duties is rumored to be protection of the Holy Grail. Though the Knights Templar have largely lost their once gigantic influence, there are rumors that they're still in existence today and still protecting the Grail. 8. Those crystal skulls, they actually exist. Kind of. It seems like it would be a prop built from someone's imagination, but the MacGuffin in Indiana Jones and the Crystal Skull actually existed in our world. Some historians believe that crystal skulls go all the way back to the time of the Aztecs or earlier. Either way, crystal skulls are thousands of years old, but no one knows exactly where they came from or how they came to be. One interesting fact, though, the crystal skull prop in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was so accurate that producers got sued by the government of Belize, with officials thinking it was a real skull that had actually been stolen. 9. The Chachapoyas actually did exist. The idol that Indiana Jones takes from the temple at the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark was made up, though it was based on a real Aztec idol. Even though the fertility idol is fake, the Chachapoyas were actually very real. The Chachapoyas were wiped out by the Incas in the 15th century, but until then, they had lived in modern-day Peru. The Jovitos, of course, were also made up. The lore of the films has them being descendants of the Chachapoyas, but seeing as the Chachapoyas were completely defeated and destroyed centuries earlier, that wasn't the case. 10. There was a pretty real black market for artifacts. In Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, the film opens with Indy trading the remains of Nurhaci for a valuable diamond with Chinese gangster Lao She. As it turns out, there is a very real black market for antiquities throughout history and even still today. Police in the UK even have divisions dedicated to this type of crime. Most of the trafficking of antiquities today is done by terrorist organizations. The Department of Homeland Security in the United States has recovered hundreds of millions of dollars worth of artifacts this century. So which of these is your favorite? Let us know in the comments. Be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel for a lot more on Indiana Jones, entertainment, gaming, and all of nerd culture. Till then, have a great day, everybody.